Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. It is 12:15 p.m. here in Glasgow. It's 7:15 a.m. for those of you on the East Coast, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to COP26, International Climate Change Conference, which you may have seen in the news, gathering heads of state, ministers, climate change advocates from the private sector and the public sector, as well as young advocates, including myself and some of my colleagues here today. I've had the distinct honor of traveling to past COPs, and at this COP, I'm extremely excited to introduce a really important guest to speak with us today. I'm happy here to be joined by Tom Steyer, the co-executive director and founder of Galvanize Climate Solutions, an incredible organization which you'll hear a lot about today. You may know Tom Steyer from past experiences and leadership on the climate movement for a long time, and he has been an idol of mine who I'm honored to be here with today. So I'd like to introduce you, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you, Mr. Steyer.
Keyon, call me Tom, and it's great to be here with you too.
Thank you, Tom. So let's get right into it. There's a lot going on at this conference. I have been here since Monday, but since leading up to it, there has been so much build up. And so I'm wondering, in your time here so far and from what you had read before, what are your impressions? How do you feel about the conference? What excites you?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that I came into this COP with very low expectations. I thought there was a very high probability that the pledges that had been made by countries had overwhelmingly been made. Those pledges added up to a projected increase of 2.2 degrees Celsius, which is not great. And I thought that there would not be much new news at this COP. And as we all know, there has been news. So on a government basis, including India's pledge, those pledges, if fulfilled, would add up to a change of 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is a big change. And in addition, there have been pledges from governments in terms of controlling methane release, in terms of controlling deforestation. There's been a lot of government news. But I think the biggest story of this COP for me, Keyon, is that I believe this is the conference which, in effect, has passed the baton from governments to some combination and partnership between governments and private industry. That this is the conference where corporations and financial people and entrepreneurs and civil society in general have really showed up, and going forward, I believe that it's that combination that's really going to carry the baton and get it done.
I mean, that's a very strong takeaway that I share with you, because I've noticed in some of the pledges, the methane pledge, you have to think about how we're going to get there. And many of these pledges need to be fulfilled by those kinds of partnerships. That's somewhere that you've been leading for a long time, but I'm incredibly inspired by your new shift again to the private sector with Galvanize Climate Solutions, because again, that shift to implementing a lot of the agreements that we're concerned won't be fulfilled is going to take private sector action. So I'd love if you can tell me more about how you've shifted to Galvanize Climate Solutions and why it's so important right now.
Well, Keyon, I spent 33 years as a full-time professional investor. I started my own business. I built it up over 27 years. I left it in 2012 really to become a full-time advocate on climate, because I felt as if particularly in my home country, the United States, we needed to come together as a society and determine to solve this problem. So I want to put this in the context of an old investment adage, which is strategy is easy, execution is hard. And I really felt as if we hadn't even fulfilled the strategy part of this journey. And so I really wanted to push as hard as I could with other advocates to get our country and to get the world on the right path. And I determined at the end of last year, at the end of 2020, and I believe this COP bears out that analysis, that the strategy part of this in the main was over. Americans know we have to do this. 75% of Americans know we have to move aggressively to a sustainable future, including 57% of Republicans. That was the strategy part. Now we're into execution, and execution really is hard. And I'm seeing that at this COP, talking to people who build wind turbines, people who sequester carbon. Every part of this is at work. And so I wanted to go back to my roots of being an investor, of being involved in private sector outcomes to try and drive as fast as possible. And our motto is innovate, accelerate, scale. And all of those things are necessary because, okay, we have to rebuild the world, but we have to do it in a hurry because we have an absolute time frame over which it's got to happen. If we could do this over a couple hundred years, it wouldn't be a big deal. The problem is, at the rate in which we're emitting carbon, we use up all of our budget to reach 1.5C in 8 years. So it's, if we have a great solution in 30 years, it's not enough. Winning slowly at this is exactly the same as losing.
I mean, that's so incredible. And in the few years that I've become, very closely associated with all of your work, I've come to understand the way that you implement and loop in civil society and advocacy into this private sector action. I mean, I can hear it from even the way you talk about what we need to do. And for those watching, I'm sure just in a few minutes, you've come to understand how much this level of advocacy and what I've called from an inspiration, a justice nerve, still bleeds into the work that you're doing in the private sector. And one of the things that struck me was at a past event, the way you've talked about this new term, it's new to me at least, of movement capitalism. That's something that has stayed with me ever since you've brought it up because it resonates as somebody who understands that the private sector plays a role, but is still thinking about how you bring in that sense of justice and that urgency, the time and the short time period we have to get things done. So can you just tell me more about what movement capitalism means to you?
Well, the whole idea behind movement capitalism is that you tap into the energy and the entrepreneurship and the competition of the private sector, but you do it to solve society's goals. I mean, our company's called Galvanize Climate Solutions,
right.
And it's purpose-driven and totally focused on that outcome. So we know that this is not going to get solved by the private sector on its own. In fact, the idea behind movement capitalism is that yes, we tap into the dynamism of capitalism, but the idea that it would be divorced from the rest of society, that it would be divorced from policymakers is, in my mind, completely unrealistic. The truth is this is going to be solved by society as a whole. And let's just step back for 1 second about some of the really big changes that have been driven by a need to deal with our climate crisis. The fact that solar and wind energy is much cheaper than fossil fuel energy now. Or the fact that we have competitive electric vehicles. How is that true? None of that would have happened without policy. Governments around the world subsidized solar and wind so that they could grow, so they could drive down the cost curve, and now they're much cheaper. Electric vehicles, they had to catch up to 100 years of working on internal combustion engines and making them more efficient. Governments supported that. So as we move forward, movement capitalism implies that yes, it is about investing, it is about creating new businesses, it is about making money, but it's got to be done in conjunction with the rest of society and meeting society's needs. We've been driven to this point, to this crisis, by people blindly following the profit motive. We really can't do that anymore. This has got to be a much more thoughtful and holistic way of reacting, or we really won't get out of this problem.
I can't agree more. And when we think about the way that the climate crisis has impacted us, including the way that you're speaking about it, I still resonate with how it's impacting us at home in the US. I mean, we're at COP26. There's a lot of time devoted, rightly so, to the impact that the climate crisis is happening elsewhere, but it is happening in the United States. We're dealing with a lot of concerns, and the climate crisis is facing us now. And so again, on the public-private partnerships, I think those are incredibly essential in the US. And I'd love just quickly if you can elaborate on how we can implement public-private partnerships in the US.
Well, you've said a couple of things that I think are really important, and I just want to take off on them in terms of starting with the idea of climate justice. Because what I've found over the last 15 years is that if you want to come up with a policy that works for climate, you have really got to start with an awareness of justice and with participation and leadership from people, from the communities where the co-pollutants have really devastated people's health. And so what we found in California, and I'm a Californian and have worked on energy policy there for 15 years, the success of California's energy policies have really been driven by leaders from the poorest zip codes in the state who are aware of air pollution and water pollution and who understand that you can't separate those very serious short-term health problems from reducing carbon emissions. So in fact, when we think about a public-private partnership, it implies that we have to be bringing in the broader values and awarenesses from society as a whole if we're going to come up with the policies, but also the businesses and the products that are going to work. And let me just digress for 1 second.
Of course.
This. Capitalism is actually a democratic process. But in capitalism, you get to vote with your dollars. So if you don't have any dollars to spend, you in effect don't have any votes. And you understand that in any kind of just society, that's not right. So the idea of a public-private partnership is to make sure that in the dynamism of the private sector, you have the values of society as a whole that take into account the goals that have to include people who are absolutely valuable and important, but who may not get to vote with their dollars in any kind of proportionate way. That's why that partnership is so essential.
I think I really can't think of anybody more fitting to deliver that kind of a comment because of your long time interweaving between galvanizing the private sector, but also to empowering and uplifting young Americans and uplifting people to use their vote and to use, if they have dollars, to use those dollars for good. And so, again, I'm really inspired to get your perception on defining what is going to be successful, because you know what's successful that comes from the private sector, and you understand when people are being disenfranchised because you've been fighting for their enfranchisement for so long. So, you know, as a young person here with UNA USA, and for all the young people back in the US who are looking at COP and trying to understand how it's going to impact them, but also what's successful out of all these deals, what is really going to achieve that? How would you measure success here at COP?
Well, for COP this year, to me, there is going to be this handoff to what I would think of as movement capitalism, and that is going to get measured to a large extent by what happens after the COP.
Right.
Because to a very large extent, and you can already see this in the press, people are going to look at this, and originally the COP, it's a UN deal. That means it's a country deal. So they're going to look at how much do the promises add up to? And that's the way COPs have been traditionally looked at, and that's important. But the real question for this COP is going to be, does this handoff work? And do we all go back to our respective countries and start executing on it? Because if that doesn't happen, it really doesn't matter what either corporate leaders who promise to be net zero in 2050 or countries that promise to be net zero in 2050 say, because we have a real problem this decade. So if people are inspired by this, if people understand what has to happen, and we go back and all of a sudden projects start happening, dirt starts moving, companies start being formed and growing and acting in the real world, that means this COP has worked. Because that kind of momentum in the real world is what it's going to take to actually control our climate crisis. And if we do that in a real way with justice, then I'm going to feel like this COP really came together.
You know what, then I have a perfect example for you in your home state of how it is working, because I spoke with high school students from Mark Keppel High School in the LA area, and they were telling me about how they were taking their lessons from COP and from other negotiations, and they looked at how pollution in their own city, in the city of LA, was impacting their lives, and they're already taking action at the high school level. And so plenty of UNA USA chapters at the high school level, the college level, and at the city level are taking action. I think they're following your lead and the outcomes of this conference, and so I would love to see that happen more from this COP. That's also how I'd measure it.
Look, there's no question that young people have always led change.
Right.
Because old people are at some level wed to the status quo. They are, they define the status quo. Old people are the people who are profiting from the status quo. Young people are looking at the world and saying, we can rewrite this, we can change this, we have to change this. We're not bought into what's gone on in the past. And that is a message, that is a cohort, and that is leadership that is absolutely critical to pushing this world to make it happen.
That's an amazing final message, and really it's been an honor to talk with you about all of these things. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all of those who are watching from UNA USA. If you're joining in from anywhere else live or watching this after, it was an honor to have you here. Again, my name is Keyon Rostamnezhad, Global Goals Ambassador for Climate Action with UNA USA, and hopefully take these messages, take them home, and keep acting and keep pushing on. So I'll say thank you and have a good day.